I recently watched a video by up-and-coming YouTuber Adam Something, and it was surprisingly bad. It was surprising because Adam Something has some great videos, but this particular video is a travesty, and I'm going to show you why. So, let's go through his video bit by bit and respond to his points as they come.
We have heard it said over and over again, mostly by the likes of Ben Shapiro, that academia is a hostile environment to conservatives.
Adam begins by making the assumption that it is mostly the likes of Ben Shapiro who make this claim. This should tip you off that he has a limited and cliched understanding of his opposition. There are numerous well-known voices who have little in common politically with Ben Shapiro, take Piers Morgan for a popular example, and even some classically liberal voices from academia and pop culture such as Jordan Peterson and even Joe Rogan, who have repeatedly claimed that academia and institutions are largely biased, nay, intolerant of not only conservatives but also of engaging in good faith discussions with them.
Academia hates conservatives, it ignores them, it censors them even. Higher education has become this cultural Marxist SJW far-left bubble, this big safe space where no other view is tolerated, and conservative views are outright hated. But is this really true? So let me tell you a bit about my personal experiences in higher education. I have a degree in the humanities. I've graduated from a rather average university in Central Eastern Europe, but through the Erasmus exchange program I could spend one whole year at Heidelberg University in Germany. Now Heidelberg is Ivy League. It's cutting edge, top 100, serious research, huge budget, and a campus the size of a small city. Now my degree involved quite a bit of sociology and cultural studies. So in both universities I was near the fire, so to speak. I was doing the subjects that are considered to be most overrun by crazy leftists and cultural Marxists and what have you. So did I encounter any conservative viewpoints during my studies at any of the two universities? No. We had many political discussions with my fellow students, and honestly, I cannot recall people who were even right-leaning, much less conservative.
Here, Adam is honest about his experience at university. He explains that he did not notice conservatives at his school, or at least ones willing to have political discussions. Note that he says he did not even hear from people who leaned right. He is not talking merely about staunch conservatives. He goes on to posit an explanation for this conspicuous absence, and it is that explanation which I will respond to.
And honestly, I cannot recall people who were even right-leaning, much less conservative. And why is that? Let's take Heidelberg University as an example. It has extremely high standards and it's very difficult for a student to get enrolled there. This is no for-profit community college, only the best and the brightest can get in. And those who do generally possess traits such as rationality, open-mindedness, curiosity, and a readiness to change one's mind in the face of new evidence. And right here we can start seeing the problem.
Yes, we can see the problem, just not the problem he wants us to see. He assumes that a person who makes it into a prestigious university is naturally rational, open-minded, curious, and possesses a readiness to change their mind in the face of new evidence. But this is untrue. There are many traits that can get you into a prestigious university. Furthermore, some of these traits will depend on the subject you study. While it is true that you generally need to have a high degree of intelligence in at least one commonly accepted dimension in order to be admitted into a prestigious school, there are very few selection markers in a university admissions process that directly select for open-minded students who are willing to change in the face of new evidence. Just because Adam asserts that these open-minded traits are present in academia does not mean they are. Let's take a look at the submission requirements to be considered for entry into Heidelberg University as an international student. You can see that ACT or SAT scores are listed. ACT and SAT scores demonstrate a certain level of mastery over subjects, and they also do correlate with intelligence, but they do not measure one's open-mindedness, curiosity, or readiness to change, at least not in some quantifiable way. The only possible way to communicate how open-minded you are as an applicant at Heidelberg University is through your personal statement or recommendation letter. Notice also that both the ACT/SAT scores and recommendation letters are optional submissions, so personal character and demonstration of a certain level of competence in subjects, measured in a standardized fashion, is not what gets you into Heidelberg University. Then what does get you in? My argument here is a rather focused attack. Looking at the bigger picture, the reason Adam needs to assume that academics are by nature open-minded is because it is the first of two false premises in his argument, which I will get to later.
And right here we can start seeing the problem. Do any of these values describe conservatism? Absolutely not. They are in fact antithetical to modern conservatism.
First of all, we should take a moment to acknowledge that conservatism is a broad term that can mean different things to different people, just as liberalism or leftism can mean different things to different people as well. While Adam would like to narrow the meaning of the term to describe conservatives as people who are not open to any new ideas, this is in practice clearly absurd, just as it would be absurd to assume that liberals are people who accept any new ideas presented to them without any rational forethought. Secondly, let's take a look at Adam's syllogistic argument. It's something like this. People in academia are open-minded. Conservatives are not open-minded. Therefore, conservatives are not in academia. While I could refute Adam's first premise by bringing up numerous examples of people in academia being closed-minded, I want to take a different approach first. Adam assumes that the left is actually open in the sense that they are open to alternative ideas, which is a very different understanding of openness than that which is defined within the field of psychology. Openness as a psychological trait is highly correlated with intelligence and the ability to generate numerous ideas and evaluate them. If the left was categorically extremely high in openness and conservatives were, by contrast, low in openness, one would expect conservatives to have at the least a significant reduction in intelligence when compared to the left. This does not, however, bear out when reviewing data, which is much more complex and mixed, with conservative types exhibiting higher intelligence in some areas and lower in others, and vice versa. See the link in the description for one example. So working backwards, the overarching insignificance between the intelligence of the left and conservatives demonstrates that the left is not actually as open from a true psychological standpoint as they claim. This is a rather complex way of attacking Adam's claim. A simpler tactic is to point out that there are numerous examples of the left attacking conservatives, removing them from institutions, and refusing to engage in dialogue. This all points to a striking lack of openness, not to be fair from all members of the left, but certainly in the ecosystem of ideas as a whole. Members of the left are not holistically open on a wide scale, rather they have frequently adopted the viewpoints of some people who were actually open for their own time. The very fact that many of the linchpins of leftist thought, such as Marxism, feminism, and gender ideology, have been clung to increasingly tightly over time, demonstrates a widespread lack of openness. One would expect a truly open person to periodically revisit their most important ideologies and reevaluate them in the light of new information. We see the opposite, broadly speaking. All of this talk about openness is at a higher level somewhat irrelevant. Even if Adam could demonstrate that the left is much more open than conservatives, there would not be any reason to assume that the result of that openness automatically would lead to morally upright policies, which is precisely what Adam assumes. This is demonstrated by the fact that he brings up examples of hotly debated issues and then asserts that the left has the most moral or ethical view of the world, and as you'll see later, that conservatives are categorically racist.
So right off the bat, universities have a selection bias against conservatives. And keep in mind, this is not deliberate. It's just a natural consequence of how the world works. But even if you do manage to get into academia as a conservative, holding your average conservative views such as anti-gay rights, anti-trans rights, anti-immigration, anti-big government, anti-abortion, and anti-welfare, you will find that you will not be able to engage in any sort of meaningful discussions inside academia.
While these issues are hotly debated, I want to point out that Adam is using the anti-prefix to oversimplify and take control of the language landscape. By categorizing his opponent's views as merely reactions against something rather than legitimate defenses of something, he asserts his own views to be the status quo or ethical norm. Although this may seem like a minor point, I see this as the sign of someone who may be more interested in being a sophist and using language to his advantage rather than actually discovering truth. I may be wrong, but this is the impression that I get.
Turns out academic discussion is a bit different from poll threads. And so suppose that as that stereotypical conservative, you try to enter this academic space where minority rights are being discussed. The topic of discussion being the socio-economic circumstances of Roma people in Central Eastern Europe from the point of view of government policymaking from 1920 until 1989. Now, you entering this space and offering brilliant and incisive commentary such as brown people bad will most likely get you kicked out, perhaps not on the most polite terms either.
Adam appears blind to the irony here. He admits that he is using a stereotypical conservative in this example.
And so suppose that as that stereotypical conservative, you try to enter this academic space.
Ironically, the left claims to dislike stereotypes. Granted, even the stereotype is absurd on its face. If Adam has a good case to make that demonstrates that the majority of conservatives who make it into a prestigious university are so racist that they would not be able to have an intelligent conversation about the historic socioeconomic circumstances of the Roma in Eastern Europe, then he should make his case instead of resorting to ad hominem. Ironically, Adam also appears to be using an example that proves the opposite of the point that he wants to make. Let me explain. Let's take Italy as an example. 82% of Italians have negative views about the Roma, but over 60% of Italians are left-leaning on a variety of issues. Therefore, even if every single right-leaning Italian was racist with regard to the Roma population in Italy, a sizable chunk of Italian leftists appear to have the same racist attitudes towards the Roma as the right. I'm pointing this out not to encourage the racist attitudes, but to demonstrate that prejudice can be found on both sides of politics. The left is not a wonderland free of ethnic bias, as Adam implies.
And the reason for that is because contemporary popular conservative views have been desperately outpaced by modern academia. We know that gay rights don't lead to the collapse of the traditional family. We know that trans rights don't lead to the end of the two genders and a mass sex change operation wave for gullible children. We know that immigration doesn't lead to the fall of Western civilization. We know that big government doesn't lead to communism and George Orlando's 1964. We know that women's rights to an abortion is a mostly beneficial thing. We know that welfare programs work and that the bootstrap mentality doesn't.
Adam seems pretty certain about these things, right? We know. I am not going to respond to his assertions here other than to say we don't categorically know any of those things with the degree of certainty that he would like us to believe that we can have. While I could spend time teasing out the nuances of each of these subjects to prove that Adam cannot have the certainty that he claims to have, it would not be fruitful to do so unless he is willing to first engage with a similar level of nuance. For those listening, especially young folks who follow Adam, I have a bit of advice. If anyone you come across makes numerous "we know" assertions, claims consensus when there is none, and then creates their own environment in order to fabricate the appearance of consensus, they probably don't have a genuine desire to discover truth. This is particularly relevant when talking about the takeover of institutions by leftists in order to force the appearance of consensus, but it does go for conservatives as well.
For multiple decades now, conservatives have been on the losing end of every single socioeconomic debate, including issues such as segregation and women's rights to vote.
Adam uses the abolition of segregation and the suffrage movement to demonstrate that conservatives have lost the major cultural battles. While he is not wrong that conservatives have lost most of the major battles, the two he lists are bad examples. In Britain, women's right to vote was largely won through the work of the Primrose League, a conservative group. And while the conservatives in Britain were divided amongst themselves regarding suffrage, it was a completely conservative government that recognized women's right to vote under the same terms as men, meaning there were no more restrictions on women's right to vote as there had been previously. In the US, the story was similar. Republican women were the first to advocate for their right to vote and receive equal pay. During segregation, the pot was mixed across both left and right, with many Republicans and Democrats alike advocating for the end of segregation.
And this actually ties back to a larger issue within conservatism, which was also voiced by Andrew Neil, UK arch-conservative, during his famous interview with Ben Shapiro.
I'm interested that you think there's a thought movement inside the Republican Party. I mean, haven't the Conservatives run out of ideas in America? All the new policies, the Medicare for all, $15 minimum wage, the Green New Deal, they're all coming from the left, and they're popular.
Well, frankly, I'm confused by the idea.
Conservatism has not brought a single new idea to the table since decades. Modern conservatism has become this amorphous protest movement against the left's imagined hypocrisy.
While it is a bit hyperbolic to say that conservatives have not contributed anything new in recent years, this is one of the few things Adam says that seems accurate, at least in spirit. Conservatives have spent so much time creating arguments against the onslaught of constant new and untested ideas from the left that they have largely failed to contribute to culture in grand and meaningful ways.
A movement that is driven at this point by nothing else but fear and the blind, uncritical celebration of some imaginary glorious past. It has become intellectually empty, bankrupt. What major cultural war issue can we debate on an academic level if they have been proven wrong? And don't get me wrong, nothing is truly settled science, but the discussion will shift eventually as new evidence becomes available.
I respect Adam for saying that nothing is truly settled, but it stands in opposition with his earlier statements about his certainty regarding all the major issues that conservatives disagree with the left on.
Academics might have discussions about race relations and might do studies about race relations, but no one's talking about the inferior skull shape of the Negroid race anymore.
If Adam thinks that scientific racism was unique to conservatism, he could simply visit Wikipedia's page on scientific racism and research its main proponents to find that that is not the case. The problem is that Adam frequently assumes the moral high ground by taking controversial modern issues and compares them to issues that are no longer very controversial. Adam may respond by saying that academia has a strong consensus when talking about welfare, for example, but he has already admitted that essentially half of the population is not represented within academia. There is no shortage of serious research done by conservative thinkers. If the left is so open-minded, they could engage with conservatives and invite them into serious discussions at their institutions instead of barring them from entry. From the outside, it almost appears that the left is, broadly speaking, afraid of what they might find if they engage in more good-faith discussions. Of course, Adam would probably not admit this. He would simply say that the left has no interest in debating fools or bigots. But then again, to say such a thing might contradict his own notion that the left is categorically open-minded.
You know, academia didn't forcibly excise conservatives from its ranks. It's just that conservatives have dug their heels in and they got left behind. And I'm not saying it's impossible to be a conservative and an academic at the same time. These people do exist, but they're like an evolutionary biologist who's also a young Earth creationist. I mean, it's certainly possible, and people like this do exist, but you have to do some pretty hardcore mental gymnastics. And you have to really compartmentalize your beliefs if you want to do any meaningful academic work. Otherwise, if you really were true to your core beliefs, all your research papers would just read, "God done did it." And that's a big reason why there aren't too many creationist biologists. Or, for that matter, conservative academics. And that's the reason why academia is so left-leaning. There is no conspiracy, there is no censorship, there is no ill intention.
While I want to stay away from the question of conspiracy and ill intention, there are numerous examples of censorship against not just conservatives, but anyone who disagrees with a particular strand of leftist thought. If you don't know of any examples, or if your leftist friends say that the right is just making these stories up, consider the popular case of college professor Brett Weinstein, who was stalked and physically attacked by leftist students and peers in 2017 after he stood against what he considered to be a racist policy. The events led to his resignation. Was Brett unintelligent or closed-minded? Did he not deserve to be present in an academic institution? No, he was pushed out by criminal action. This is merely one example, but it is well known, and it is something that Adam should be aware of. If leftists continue to turn a blind eye to events like these, it will only get worse within their own movement.
It's just that if you understand how the world works, how society works, and you know enough about history, it suddenly becomes really difficult to be a conservative.
Here we have a baseless appeal to authority. This speaks more to Adam's personal feelings and conclusions than it does about any measurable fact. Realistically, I think that there can and should be a healthy balance between conservative and left-leaning thinkers. These left-right attitudes are somewhat hardwired into our societies and have persisted to this day for a reason. Imagine for a moment an ancient city flourishing. Suddenly, in the course of a few months, it is besieged and captured by an enemy city-state. The enemy state takes over and begins to enforce brutal restrictions and wipe out the pre-existing culture. In such a case, the conservative mind comes to the rescue. It is impelled to action to force the invader out and to preserve its own cultural fabric and identity. Now imagine the same city in many years falls into the hands of corrupt rulers, and the people are downtrodden. Here it is the left-leaning person that comes to the rescue, asking, why can't things be better? Why can't our culture be healthier? These are, of course, oversimplifications, but they at least represent a decently open-minded hypothesis on the nature of conservative liberal dynamics. Adam's theory, on the other hand, is closed-minded, plagued by certainty, spite, and bad faith. Adam has some cool content on his channel. I particularly appreciate his passion for exposing people to ideas about better urbanism and the problems associated with skyscrapers and certain infrastructure projects. Adam, if you see this, I hope you take what I've said seriously, but not too seriously, and I'm open to criticism of what I've put out there as well. Whether you liked this video or hated it, let me know in the comments below. Also, subscribe and share the video with your favorite leftists so that we can get in-depth responses like this out to more people. Thanks for watching.